Hi, everybody. This is Aaron. I am the social media manager for Solo Network, and we have a special guest today. Michelle, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, well, Aaron, thank you for having me. I feel so honored to be chatting with you and yeah, so grateful for the Sola family. And yeah, so my name is Michelle Reyes. I am the vice president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. My husband and I were also church planters here in Austin, Texas. And our church is called Hope Community Church. We are a minority led multicultural church on the east side, where I also serve as scholar in residence. And we are CCDA local networkers as well. And we have a 5 and a 2 year old. So, kind of wearing a few hats these days, keeping busy, navigating homeschooling in the midst of COVID and quarantines. And yeah, by God's grace, taking it one day at a time.
Well, Michelle, it is great to have you here. And today we're actually going to talk about your book. Your book is called Becoming All
Ah,
Things:
look at
How
that.
Small Changes Lead to Lasting Connections Across Cultures. I read it, I reviewed it on the Solo website. You'll be able to read this by the time the video comes out. But yeah, would you please give us and tell us about your book?
Yeah, well, I feel honored that you have read my book in full. It's such a special part of the journey to have spent 2 years in the making writing a book and then to finally be putting it into people's hands. But I we're in the different spaces that I'm in, whether it's in our church or at conferences, social media, online. I have noticed a recurring question that people keep asking me, and that is just how how do we start building cross cultural relationships? Where do we begin? And I think there's also oftentimes a fear. I've noticed a lot of conversations that begin with that fear of like, I don't want to, I have a desire to connect with people across cultures, but I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to offend people. And so often that fear is what keeps us from doing anything because we want to do it right. We don't necessarily have a roadmap to do it. And so, um, this is where the idea, the seed became planted of writing a book about cross-cultural relationships. And I felt like in many ways, my life and my experiences as a second generation Indian American woman, kind of living at that intersection of different cultures and worlds, really, uh, I felt like if I could share my stories and some of the bumps along the road that I've had, and if that could be a way in which to encourage and equip people in their own journeys, then that's what I wanted to do. And so that's the genesis of the book. In terms of the premise itself, the foundation of the book is First Corinthians 9 verses 19 through 23, which to boil it all down to one of the verses, Paul says, I became all things to all peoples for the sake of the gospel. And so, in that context, he's saying, to the Jew, I became like a Jew to win the Jews, and to the Gentiles, to those not under the law, I became like those not under the law to win them. And so, you know, after reflecting and studying that passage over and over again, I just thought, if Paul was saying that to us today, it would sound something like, to the African American, I became like an African American. To the Latino American, I became like a Latino American. To the Asian American, I became like an Asian American. And then the question is, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to become all things to all peoples? What is it about ourselves that we need to change or adapt in order to connect with people for the sake of Christ and for the sake of the gospel? And so my book is after answering that question.
And your book is really deeply personal. I feel like I noticed that you gave a lot of stories, personal, stories about your own life, and honestly, like some of the awkward moments that came. I remember one in your book. Actually, two stories stood out to me. One was when you were having, I guess, a party, and the story about the curry. And
Yeah.
then the other one was like, I guess, in a common meeting area where it was like supposed to be quiet, and then it was like loud. But people can read the book for that. But I want to say, yeah, you're it was deeply personal to you. I feel like because you're putting yourself out there and talking about the difficulties and the awkwardness that come with cross-cultural relations. Was it hard
For
for you
sure.
to put those things into words?
Yeah, I mean, it was a new experience because some of those stories I've never shared before, right? And you're putting your story out into the to the world, and certainly I wanted to do it in a way that, uh, while a lot of those experiences, I'm the recipient of being stereotyped or misunderstood or racially profiled, or in that chapter in the lounge, it's fellow Asian Americans who are
Right.
being there's an attempt to for them to be controlled because of their noise levels, and so um, while I am the recipient of that, I also wanted to make sure that these stories, which are so deeply personal, as you mentioned to myself, that it's I'm not trying to villainize the other person, but more so is just like this is a moment of real life. This really did happen, and this is how I experienced it, interpreted it, and my hope in opening up each chapter with these personal stories is for people to really get a glimpse and a microcosm of what it means to be an Asian American woman in this country, because I think truly more than textbooks about culture, which are important, which are completely important, we need to hear each other's stories, and you know being able to invite each other into each other's lives and say, this is how I live, and this is my embodied experience in the world, this is my pains and my hurts. I think we need to hear each other's stories to see life through each other's eyes. That's that proximity, and that's what's going to cultivate that empathy and compassion to want to change. So that's what I'm hoping will be achieved through these opening stories.
Well, I definitely was, I guess, blessed, impacted by your opening stories and by your sharing with them. Thank you for making yourself vulnerable like that. I want to go back on that Asian American component. But before we get there, you did talk about whiteness, I guess. You said in your book, you made certain that the reader understands that whiteness is not an absence of culture. I thought that was a really important point you made. Can you explain that to our audience really quick?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. There's two layers to that. The first is that I've had so many conversations with dear white sisters, right? Who, just quite frankly tell me I don't. They tell me, Michelle, I don't think about my culture. I don't have a culture. As I'm navigating throughout my day, going, driving or going to the grocery store or I'm with my kids, I'm not thinking about what's my culture or how I'm culturally expressing myself. And so that's the first layer is having conversations with people who identify as white to say, no, you do have an ethnic heritage. You just haven't leaned into it, or you've been disconnected from it in some way. And so you can't use um, whiteness as an excuse is to just say I don't have a culture. We all have a culture. But the second layer to that is that whiteness, that term, is a social construct. It's a term with a historical marker because it was really uh, cultivated and utilized during the Atlantic slave trade, and it was utilized to basically describe anything um, that was not black. And so there's an immediate racial dynamic, racialization to that term. And when whiteness is aligned with white supremacy, you see the ways in which, um, these systems of hierarchies of superior white people and inferior black and brown peoples began to develop. And so it's just important to understand where these terms come from, which is also why in my book, I encourage people to be hyper local, hyper specific about who they are, because we will not begin to deconstruct these sort of racialized categories until we can begin to move from, I don't have a culture, or oh, I'm just some generic white, to no, I'm actually Dutch American or German American or Italian American, and really uh, understanding who we are as cultural beings, valuing it, celebrating it in the other. And so, all that to say, there's layers to what I mean by whiteness there.
And you do a really good job of explaining these things, not only right here in our interview, but in your book as well. I learned a lot. Something else that stood out to me was the term code switching. I was aware of this, but I don't think I knew like the actual term for it, but I knew like, what it is. Can you explain what this is to our audience? And then also tell us what's like a good type of code switching and what's like a bad type of code switching. Because I think you kind of make a case for both in your book. Am I right?
For sure, for sure. I mean, I argue this in the book, to an extent, we all code switch. When people start dating, right? Like they're putting their best foot forward. They're, you know, you know, maybe changing how they talk or how they behave because they're trying to impress somebody. You can even code switch at times when you're, trying to get a job and you're trying to impress, your potential future boss. It's adapting the way we speak or act or even the way we dress to kind of be somebody different. And sometimes that can be good, right? Like you're trying to be somebody better, put your best foot forward, if you will. So in many ways, we all do it to a certain extent. But for Black and Brown people, when I'm talking about code switching in chapter 4, it's this idea of saying, okay, just act white. Like, okay, I need to fit in. I need to not stick out. I'm going to just act white. And so I'm talking about code switching in that sense. And I think, I'm rooting my conversation about code switching once again in 1 Corinthians 9, and there is commentary even there about what it means to be free in Christ. And so what I really want people to walk away from that chapter is that we are free in Christ, and we are not bound by the world to impress the world, if you will. And there are examples where even Paul himself is criticized, right, by the elite, and the elite want him to act a certain way. They want him to talk a certain way, and he comes from this line of Pharisees, taught by Gamaliel, the educated of the educated. So this guy can speak, right? Like he could be like the elite in terms of his eloquence and whatnot. But he casts that aside and says, I'm not here to have this sort of celebrity status. I'm not here to impress. I'm not here to, look good and get the money and all these sorts of things. I'm going to be all things to all peoples. I'm going to speak the vernacular of the peoples to win them. And so I think what this means for Black and Brown peoples today is that we are not bound by the rules of this world that says like this is how you have to act to fit in. This is how you have to act to be labeled cool or popular or whatnot. We don't have to just conform ourselves in white spaces because for fear of sticking out and being identified as different. So that's what I mean in terms of we are not called as followers of Jesus to code switch, because we are not here to just appease men. At the same time, I do think that there are opportunities that all of us, but particularly minorities, could choose to code switch while being free in Christ, but to do so because we understand, okay, this is not somebody who is openly racist, openly abusive. Like those are conversations and people that you should say, no, I'm not here to bend over backwards for. So, I mean, I want to be clear about who I'm talking about here, but I think that there are, well-intentioned folks who are just ignorant, and will say things that are hurtful. But I know that their heart and their posture is a desire to learn. They want to grow. They want to do better. It's just, bless their heart, they're really stumbling. And so it's moments like that I'm like, you know what? I am going to speak into this person's life and adapt my language, adapt how I engage with them, for the sake of Christ, to lovingly educate them and say, come follow me, come on this journey with me. So I think there's moments like that we can adapt the way we speak and the way we behave with folks, in a way that's part of winning them for the gospel.
Yes. And you said lovingly educate them. That
Yes.
term lovingly is so important.
Yes.
And then for the gospel, I think that in reading your book, I felt that evangelism was the heart of your book, or it was like really driving all of
Mm.
these things. Obviously, loving our neighbors, but then through the gospel. First, I want you to speak to that. Am I correct in that assessment that evangelism is emphasized in your book?
Yeah,
And then,
absolutely.
what are practical steps we can take to connect and speak across cultures specifically for sharing the gospel? So like, yeah, we're connecting, we're making things. What can we do to be proactive for gospel evangelism?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, not to like over dramatize the message of my book, but I'm trying to say is that I know it's really popular right now to be culturally competent and to
Mm,
like have diverse friends and things like that. And what I'm trying to say is that for us as Christians, um there are appropriate and inappropriate or healthy and unhealthy ways of connecting across cultures where our biblical witness is at stake in the way we do this, right? And so
mm-hmm.
um, the way in which we choose to connect with folks across cultures will either represent Christ to them in a way that's inviting or in a way that will turn them away from the gospel. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that the motivation for why we need to check ourselves, why we need to check our thoughts, our words, our actions, the reason why we need to continue to self-reflect about how can I continue to adapt myself, to connect with other people in ways that make them feel loved and that make them feel understood, is because this is part of our gospel presentation. And so in that sense, the way we cross cultures is extremely, evangelistic. Um, in terms of practical steps to connect and speak across cultures, yeah, I think um, some of the things that I share in my book, one is just learning that we're not the standard. Like when it comes to culture, it's not always right and wrong.
Mm.
I think it was my colleague Richard Lee at AACC who said sometimes it's just right or left. Like it's not right or wrong, it's just right or left, in the sense that there's a lot of things that people of different cultural groups do that are just different, whether it's our appreciation of noise levels or the food we eat or the way how we treat our elders, or are we individualistic or communal,
Mm,
how we understand worship, how we understand God,
mm,
and prayer, the role of prayer. And um you know in different churches, it's either you're praying one at a time or everyone's praying together at the
right,
same time, and it's
right.
very loud. And it's not like a right or wrong thing, it's just different. And so having a posture first that we are not the standard, I think, is huge, because this is immediately what then leads to um, judging, which then often leads to controlling, which can lead to very damaging, traumatic, painful, uh, you know, ways of dealing with people. And so that's one thing, is learning that we are not the standard. And then second, which could be the other side of the coin, is learning to be okay with feeling uncomfortable. And that's a question I ask in the book: is how much cultural discomfort are you willing to forbear? I think our witness of the gospel would go forth so much further if we learned at times to just keep our mouth shut, and to not be scrunching up our face, or challenging someone, or always asking why, or what are you doing here, or what do you mean by this, or I see you as a threat. And
Mm,
just keeping our mouth shut and learning to enjoy the other person, and to
mm,
say, I'm going to I'm going to sit in my own discomfort and not try to lash out in any way because I feel uncomfortable. So perhaps those are two sides of the coin, learning that we're not the standard and learning to sit in this cultural discomfort. But I think those are two practical ways that people will feel loved and people will see Christ in us if we can do those two things well.
Michelle, that was so good. There's so much wisdom that you have, and I'm honestly just learning all these things, and so I appreciate you just for being able to articulate it so well.
Praise
I
God.
want to talk. I want to talk about people who are maybe younger. How can parents or even youth group leaders, youth pastors, best introduce these sort of topics or even start these conversations with students?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I would almost flip the question, if you will, and instead of because I feel like topics like diversity and culture, they're like one topic out of many, it's like, okay, in Q3, we're going to do a cultural study,
yeah.
and then we're not going to talk
4-week
about
study
it.
And then we're moving on.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is the disservice because it teaches families and children that this is something that we can step into and then step back out of. Whereas what I'm trying to show in my book and through my stories is that this is my whole life reality. Like I can't step out of my brown skin. I can't step out of daily or weekly or monthly experiences of being profiled or stereotyped or misunderstood or the recipient of racism. And so because of that, and even because of the sad reality that my young children have also experienced these sorts of interactions, from everything from a few months back, I was going on a walk with my kids in our own neighborhood, and we were stopped by a couple of women that wouldn't let us move forward on the sidewalk until we proved that we lived in that neighborhood and told them our address. And like they didn't believe that we lived in our neighborhood because of the color of our skin, and my children are standing there listening to this and wondering, why is this woman asking us these questions, right? My son has been denied medical service at a local medical clinic because of racial misprofiling. But and the list goes on. And so all that to say, conversations about culture and ethnicity and race are daily conversations in the home. And every day we're talking about our skin color with our kids. We're talking about the fact that, I have Indian heritage. My husband has Mexican heritage. We're talking about the foods we eat, the things that we're proud of, the values and traditions that are part of our families and our cultural narratives. And we're also reading books daily, if not weekly, about skin color and God's, wonderful idea for diversity on this earth, so that my children both are so proud of who they are and their cultural makeup, and that's what they're immediately drawn to and they see in other children, but in a way that's positive, affirming, celebratory. And I think that's particularly for Christian families, that's the approach we need to take, that this is an everyday, all of life type of discipleship. This is spiritual formation for our children. And certainly the church has a role to play. I'd love to see the church grow in their discipleship of culture and ethnicity. But I think even for Christian families, for parents who send their kids to Christian school and go to church and all of this, we have a very unique and important responsibility to begin that discipleship in the home as an everyday rhythm.
Yes, and discipleship in the home, I love that. And the everyday rhythm is also very important. These are our lived experiences. And unfortunately, it is something that we often have to find ourselves talking about every day. I want to talk about acts of violence and hate that we've been seeing in the media, even today as we're recording this.
Yeah.
Michelle, how should we respond to these things? And really, what I want to ask you is how can we not get discouraged about these things? What's our right response, and how do we not get overwhelmed by
Oh
everything that
man.
happens?
That's a great question. I think one that I'm still trying to figure out because
Mm,
admittedly there is a there is an element of discouragement, right? I mean,
hmm.
this hate crimes against Asian Americans, well, anti-Asian racism has existed throughout US history, but it's
Right.
been magnified in a unique way over the last year because of COVID-19.
Hmm.
The racism against the Black community has
Mm.
also been magnified in a very unique way over this past year, those tragedies just keep happening, like
Yeah.
wave after wave, like you're in the ocean just trying to get a breath, and you finally do, only to just get hit again by another wave. And
Hmm.
so I think even in this week and hearing about what's happening in Minnesota, where my family, that's where I grew up. I grew up in Minneapolis, and
Mm.
my sister and her husband are still there,
Mm.
and everything that's happening with Dante Wright, and talking with friends, with some dear Black sisters who are just like they told me they're not even angry. They're just too exhausted to be angry because
Right.
of this cycle that doesn't end. So I'm still I'm still trying to figure out how to not be discouraged. I think there is some of that. I think is just it's a reflection of our broken world, and how these evils will not be brought to justice until Jesus returns. But in
Mm.
terms of how we respond in our home, I think no matter what no matter what the racial tragedy is, whether it's something against the Asian American community or somebody else, we have tried to um, model and teach also to our children a biblical posture of lament, that no
Mm.
matter what it is, who has been hurt, that our first response is to go to God,
Mm.
and to just make space for our grief. As awkward and uncomfortable as it is sometimes, we try to have our children see us weeping, so
Mm.
that they
Mm. Mm.
know the heaviness of these realities. I mean, it was so hard to tell my son found me weeping on March 16th, and having to tell him that people like us, fellow Asian Americans, had been shot and killed. It was one of the hardest
Mm.
conversations to have with him, and him
Mm.
just sitting with me, weeping and in that grief.
Mm.
But in biblical lament, um, the posture is to make space for that sort of grief, with turning to God with the hope that He will make things right. And
Mm.
so
Mm.
I think if we are to have any sort of way in which to taper ourselves against the discouragement of the world, it is to continue to say Maranatha, come,
Hmm.
Lord
Yes.
Jesus,
Come, Lord
come.
Jesus, come.
And
Mm.
that we do know that He will one day come and restore all things and bring justice to this earth. And even if these perpetrators are not given due justice in the here and now, that justice is coming. And
Mm.
sometimes that's the only hope that we can cling to in these times.
Yeah. Amen, Michelle. And he'll wipe away every tear, and
Mm,
it will be so good to behold him. um,
amen.
I live in the San Gabriel Valley. This is one of the
Mm,
most populated areas of Asian Americans in the United States, and I understand it's very different than living where you live, or
yeah.
across the nation, and in all these other places. So I want to ask you, for those who are comfortable in our enclaves, I want to say, can you convince us that it's worth the trouble to go out of our way to connect across cultures?
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, I mean, I don't mean to be blunt, but I'll be a little blunt, I
Sure.
suppose,
Yeah.
because I think, on the one hand, being in a cultural comfort zone, being in a monocultural space where most of the people that you rub shoulders with either look like you or think like you or
Hmm.
live lives certain ways. On the one hand, there there isn't anything inherently sinful about that.
Okay.
I think about even like I think about we have friends who are church planters in rural Kansas, like rural Kansas. And there's not much diversity in that demographic, right?
Sure,
They
sure.
have a small church. There's not many people there, and there's nobody else to go reach out to. And so they are predominantly Anglo-American church and an Anglo-American community. And so
Mm,
I don't want people to feel guilty just
okay.
because of the community that they live in. Now,
Mm,
that's not always the case. Like there are sometimes more thought and intentionality about, oh, I'm going to live here because I don't want to live by,
mm,
fill in the blank,
mhm, mhm.
or gentrification processes are also at work and whatnot too. But I think if 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 you are within your own monocultural space and you have no desire to leave that monocultural space, one, you're going to be living a life of cultural ignorance. you know,
Sure,
you're
sure.
not going to have much self-reflection or understanding of who you are as a cultural being if you are not able to engage with people that are different from you.
Mm.
But in terms of biblical grounds for this, I mean, I think of both the model of Jesus, but then also the model of Paul and the apostles, that they are I mean, the Great Commission is literally go out into the earth and make disciples. And that's what you see is, from uh, Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the earth. It's this gradual moving out, and so you see Philip, talking with this Ethiopian eunuch and explaining the gospel to him, and you see, others going into all sorts of different cities and sharing the gospel, and even Jesus travels to different villages and whatnot, and so um, Jesus is on the move.
Mm,
Disciples and the apostles are people on the move, and they're constantly crossing bound borders and cultural barriers. And we see, for example, in the life of Peter, didn't always do it very well. like he insulted people along the way, and he was like, "Oh, I'm going to eat with you. No, I'm not going to eat with you." And Paul is like, "I need to talk to you about this because you're offending people now." And so, like, we're not always going to get it right. We're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's part of the learning process. But I think that biblical precedent of being people on the move is something that we need to learn how to embody in our own lives.
I love that. I love that. It's so true. There is a prerogative for Christians to go out into all the world, like you said. Um, and I appreciate the bluntness and also the biblical warrant that you have for your response. It's so good. And for more about me, I'm making this podcast about me now. Um,
Love it.
I attend First Chinese Baptist Church of Walnut. Chinese is in our name right there. And if we're going to take
Mm,
what you're saying seriously, how can we as a church cross these cultural bridges, and even just reach out across cultures? I mean, even though we're in Walnut, there are other ethnic groups there, right? Like it's not just
yeah.
Chinese people. What would you have to say?
Yeah, that's so good. Well, let me tell you a few things that our church does, and we by no means do this perfectly, but
No, I
we're
love
on
hearing
we're
about
on a
other
journey
churches.
as well. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we do, which feels which feels very Asian Latino thing to do, is so we meet at a middle school, but in our community in East Austin. This is also historically segregated communities, disadvantaged Black and Brown communities. So there's a lot of government housing, the projects and things like that.
Mm.
We're ministering to communities with with gangs and cartels in them as well.
Oh,
And so I think there, like, you have to understand, how is it that people in your community, what are ways in which they want to be reached out to, and how would they feel love? And for our community, that, I mean, we spend time throughout the week knocking on doors and saying, "Hey, this is who we are. Can we pray for you?"
mm.
And just going door to door and praying for people throughout the apartments and the government houses around our where we meet for a church. another thing that we do is we love establishing like relationships with churches of different ethnicities and doing things, everything from like pastor swaps, right, like pulpit swaps, but then perhaps a bit deeper is like sharing communal gatherings and fellowships where there's time for prayer, for lament, where we can actually hear from people of other ethnicities and cultures what are the things that they're hurting in right now, what are they struggling with, and how can
Yeah.
we care for each other spiritually, but then even also like in the vein of Jesus's inbreaking kingdom in Mark chapter 1, and the holistic gospel, like caring for each other physically and
Mm.
socially and emotionally too. And so I think if I'm saying anything, it's that each of us as our churches and our congregations, we need to find ways to rub shoulders with other peoples, and to do
Mm.
it in a way that reflects your community, in a way that would speak love to your community, um, and to gather, to pray, to fellowship, to lament, to eat together. I cannot stress how important it is to eat together, and not just that like monthly or yearly church potluck, but I'm talking about like eating, breaking bread at tables.
Mm.
This is where real fellowship and connection across cultures is really going to happen.
Yes, I support eating meals together. Absolutely. Okay, one more personal question, I promise you, and then we can
Oh,
talk
I
about
love it. I love the personal questions.
my my son is adopted. One of my sons is adopted cross culturally, Mexican American. I'm Chinese American. Would you have any advice for me as a parent?
Oh man, that is a personal question. I love it. I it's such an important question, and particularly within the adoption world, in terms of flipping the script and really what I appreciate from my friends who are transracial adoptees is just wanting to honor the personhood, the story, and the perspective of the child.
Mm.
And I have so many friends who, particularly who are Indian, who were adopted from birth from an orphanage in India, that were raised by two, Anglo-American parents here in the U.S. And I've heard from multiple people how sad they were that their parents never made an effort to help connect them with their ethnic heritage, that
Mm.
their um, Indian culture was never talked about, Indian food was never eaten, talking about where they came from and what their story was, were just gaps that they didn't have anything to hold on to. And so now as adults, and now that they're mothers and have families and children, they're trying to, for the very first time, figure out who they are as cultural beings. And so I think if I could encourage anything in this conversation, and I'm certainly not a subject scholar in it, is to lean into you know your child's ethnic heritage, and to for him to celebrate that, to know who he is as a Mexican American child, to delight in that, be proud of that, and
Mm.
have that be so integrated into his story and part of his family.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to take that to heart. I really will. I agree with you. It's very important. And yeah, thanks for the advice, and thanks for the book too. I want to respect your time, so we're going to wrap things up a little bit. But three quick questions: what was the writing process like working with Zondervan? Do you have any upcoming books or any other projects? And then also, what's your ultimate hope and desire for becoming all things?
Yeah, so good. Well, I only have good things to say about working with Zondervan. I signed my contract with them back in June of 2019. So as I mentioned
Okay.
earlier, it's a book that's been 2 years in the
Yeah,
making.
the before times.
Yes, so it's the before times.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's such a joy to finally be in this last leg of the journey. I do actually, so I have a co-authored book coming out next year with Waterbrook, and my dear friend Helen Lee and I are co-authoring a book together titled "The Race-Wise Family,"
Nice.
9 postures of healing and hope. And so, in many ways, I'm excited about how that book builds upon the book that I've written right now, because it's all about continuing to develop cultural identities and grow in our ability to be connecting across cultures. But it's specifically for parents and equipping parents. How do you create these as rhythms for your family? How do you have conversations about things like racism and privilege to what's happening on the news with your children?
Mm,
And so each chapter will lay out a biblical framework for these things, as well as we will have like lists of family activities to do,
nice.
books to read, movies to watch. So really excited about that. That's been a special project to work on together with Helen.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, what are your hopes and dreams for becoming all things?
Well, I mean, this is certainly a book that I wrote for the body of Christ. It's a book that I wrote with the church in mind. And I'm hoping that this is a book that will inspire, encourage, and equip both, lay people and Christian leaders alike. And ultimately, I hope that this book will encourage conversations within the church and will just be a breath of fresh air in the midst of so many Christians. We have grown in our racial consciousness over this past year, but still don't know like how that knowledge should translate into action. And so
Sure.
my
Yeah.
book my book is to help Christians translate that knowledge into action.
Well, I think that your book's going to be a great help for that. I hope everybody picks it up, gives it a read. And Michelle, thank you so much for this conversation too. I hope to talk to you again soon about all of these things.
Oh, this was a joy. Thank you for having me.
Bye.